Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. All right. Hey guys. So I've heard of the bombing of Dresden. Um, I know it was, I think, possibly the most destroyed city in Germany in World War II. I'm not sure when it happened, or what the circumstances were. So join me, help me learn about this, or learn with me. Preemptive like, you can't see it there. It's there. This was out 3 hours ago, so I'm probably going to wait a few days to post this reaction. The firebombing of Dresden, war crime or justified military necessity? Let's find out. Did I say it? My name's Connor, if you're new. Hope everyone's doing well. Hi, guys. Let's learn.
13th of February, 1945, the German city of Dresden was alive with people celebrating...
1945, so it was way at the end.
The 13th of February, 1945, the German city of Dresden was alive with people celebrating Fasching, a festival much like Mardi Gras that provided a rare respite from the weight of wartime. Dresden, known for its beauty and cultural history, had largely been spared from bombing, its skyline filled with Baroque architecture and untouched landmarks. As residents wandered into the streets in costume, eager for a break from the hardships of war, air raid sirens suddenly pierced the evening air. With over 170 false alarms before, few people took it seriously. Yet, within moments, the rumble of Allied bombers overhead turned calm into chaos. At approximately 10 p.m., the first wave of Allied bombers descended.
Yeah, I'm sure, especially so late in the war, you're so used to hearing military sounds that it could catch you up even more off guard.
Overhead turned calm into chaos. At approximately 10 p.m., the first wave of Allied bombers descended upon Dresden. This initial assault involved around 240 Royal Air Force RAF Lancaster bombers, which dropped high explosive bombs across the city. Everything was a target, including residential areas, historical landmarks, medical facilities, and of course, military installations. Buildings that once symbolized Dresden's rich cultural history, such as cathedrals and palaces, were reduced to rubble. Civilians scrambled to find shelter, but safety was elusive as the destruction spread with relentless intensity. At the train station, thousands of civilians gathered, hoping to escape the worst. The station quickly became a scene of horror as bombs tore through the waiting crowds, leaving bodies scattered across the tracks and platform. Entire families perished together, and survivors struggled to comprehend the carnage around them. For those in hospitals, the attack was a surreal nightmare. Klaus von Ferendil, an injured SS officer confined to his hospital bed, watched in disbelief as explosions closed in. He, like many Dresdeners, had taken the sparing of the city up until that point as a sign that it was being spared from destruction thanks to its unique historical and cultural status. He was now learning just how wrong that assumption had been. He, through little but fluke of fate, would survive the raid, but many of the other patients wouldn't be so lucky, as a combination of smoke, fire, and eventual building collapse blocked all potential routes of exit and sealed their fate. The initial bombing paused after 30 brutal minutes. Sirens sounded the all clear, and rescue teams from nearby communities poured into the city, searching for the injured and retrieving bodies. Yet as they worked through the smoldering wreckage, another wave of bombers appeared around 1:30 a.m., this time carrying incendiary bombs. This was a strategy that was every bit as ingenious as it was macabre, as the first wave hadn't actually been intended to kill, but to destroy, and by doing so, the whole city, with debris now strewn every which way, had been transformed into a tinderbox ripe for ignition. Dresden was quickly transformed into a furnace. Fires leapt from one building to the next, easily finding a path across the rubble that now filled the streets, consuming whole blocks within minutes. Temperatures then soared to around 1500 degrees Celsius, melting glass, stone, even metal. The inferno also created a vortex effect, sucking oxygen and everything flammable toward its core, turning the streets into a firestorm, an actual incarnation of hell on earth. Survivors attempting to escape were met with walls of flames, with no way to tell which paths led to safety and which led to certain death. And unbelievably, things got worse still, because in places, the firestorm was drawing in oxygen with such force that people were pulled up off their feet and sucked in along with it. In the heart of the inferno, where temperatures peaked, clothes were ignited and skin blistered simply from proximity to the blaze. Survivors, many disoriented and blinded by smoke, wandered helplessly as flames closed in around them. The firestorm obliterated everything in its path, reducing entire neighborhoods to smoldering ruins. Familiar streets streets were rendered unrecognizable, filled with the twisted remains of what once stood. And with debris and smoke flying through the air, breathing also became impossible, and temperatures reached a point where nearly every material liquefied. On those streets, the lucky ones succumbed to a lack of oxygen and were granted a reasonably painless death. The unlucky ones had to endure the barely describable pain of being burned alive. From the hills surrounding Dresden, onlookers watched in horror as the city transformed into a blazing wasteland. One such onlooker was Victor Gregg, a British prisoner of war held in a camp just outside of the city limits. He described the scene as follows: "We could feel the terrible heat. Our bodies shook as the ground vibrated. And as if this was not enough, another terror was making its presence felt. Not really what you would call a wind, rather the air being drawn in to feed the inferno like it was a solid object. So great was its force."
So as the fire, so many people talking about, so many people, eyewitnesses recognizing that effect that the drawing in of oxygen had, is terrifying. And so I'm assuming because the fire eats up oxygen, then that creates a sort of vacuum where air rushes in. And so much must have been burning at the same time for a lot of people to feel that effect, I would imagine. Terrifying.
When all was said and done, with the Allies continuing to run sorties on the city until the 15th, a total of 2,089 aircraft had partaken in the raid, although not all of them were bombers, with that number being made up of 1,305 bombers, specifically 769 Lancasters and 9 Mosquitoes from the RAF, and 527 B-17 Flying Fortresses from the US Army Air Force, or USAAF, with the rest of the figure being made up of 527 P-51 Mustang escort fighters. Come dawn, the full damage those 1,300 plus bombers had wrought came into full view. The city, simply put, was a smoldering ruin, and within it, rescue teams began to push their way through the devastation, with each step revealing a new stomach-churning horror. Entire streets had become graveyards. Some bodies were charred beyond recognition, and others had simply melted, now being little but pools of gore, the only reminder of their once being human, the bones piled in the middle of the pool. One rescue worker even recalled finding a mother and child still clasping in a final embrace, their bodies melted together in unholy union by intense heat. The scene was no better in many of the city's air raid shelters, if not worse still. Some had survived through pure chance, do note, but many hadn't, with every person inside laying.
I have no ability to even react. I know I'm doing a reaction, but that wording of that, I'm not saying it was too far, because I'm sure that's what it was like. And so I'm not saying, like, don't do that, but it's shocking, the way Simon is putting this.
Scene was no better in many of the city's air raid shelters, if not worse still. Some had survived through pure chance, do note, but many hadn't, with every person.
I've seen a video on, I think I've seen a few videos on the firebombing of Tokyo, that the U.S. bombed Tokyo, and very similar to this. I think that might have even been more devastating. So obviously they're both giant firestorms, and so they're going to have similar experiences. So I can't ignore that comparison.
Survived through pure chance, do note, but many hadn't, with every person inside laying dead. For some, the cause had been asphyxiation, with the shelter's air supply simply being cut off by collapsing rubble. For others, it was smoke inhalation, as their shelter's air ducts had not been designed for weathering such an intense firestorm, and so they became funnels, sucking in all the surrounding smoke and condemning those inside to death through smoke inhalation. The worst scenes of all, however, were found in those shelters that had been penetrated by the flames, for there, all that was found was an ankle-deep pool of nightmarish greeny-brown liquid with a myriad of bones floating atop it. And, what with Germany's ever-worsening war situation, many of these shelters weren't even opened until after the war had concluded, by which time many of those who had died of asphyxiation or smoke inhalation had completely mummified. Even Dresden Zoo shared in the devastation, as best described by Otto Sailor Jackson, its animal inspector, who said the following regarding what he witnessed upon his return to the zoo. To quote him, "The elephants gave spine-chilling screams. Their house was still standing, but an explosive bomb of terrific force had landed behind it, lifted the dome off the house, turned it round, and put it back on again. The baby cow elephant was lying in the narrow barrier moat on her back, her legs up in the sky. She had suffered severe stomach injuries and could not move." The quote ends. And well, this, rather tragically, brings us to a part of the Dresden story that we have to address, although we really wish that we didn't have to, and that's the lies and revisionism. There's no nice way to say this, but neo-Nazis and apologists for the Nazi regime just love the bombing of Dresden, although they always claim to the exact contrary, and they love it.
We can't allow people with bad intentions to muddy the waters on events that actually happened. So ignore them. I put this on the fault of people that are so ready, not forget the neo-Nazis who are doing it for actual bad reasons. But when someone brings up something like the firebombing of Dresden, and then someone accuses them of being alike these neo-Nazis, you are doing a horrible thing. Like, I get so frustrated sometimes when talking about historical events that I just am curious about. I have no ulterior motive. I'm not trying to, I don't have some worldview I'm trying to prove with something. And so when anyone I feel like is sort of accusing me of like, whoa, what are you saying? It pisses me off beyond belief. I'm saying nothing. I'm trying to figure out something. And take the Nuremberg trials, all right? Obviously, horrible people were tried on that thing. But it's odd to me that you're telling me, I know that victors, they write the history, but you're telling me that every person in World War II that should have been tried on war crimes all happened to be on the losing side? That doesn't seem a little strange to you? And so when I say stuff like that, people are like, are you trying to put a good light on Nazis? I'm like, no, you freaking moron. I'm trying. I'm like, that's strange. I don't like that. That clearly is you don't have to say that the Nazi war criminals shouldn't have been tried to say that clearly you let a lot of Allied war crimes get off the hook. And so that hypocrisy it makes me go crazy sometimes. And so add on top of that, me trying to point that out, of people saying, are you sympathizing with Germany in World War II? No, you freaking moron. God dang it.
Because it provides fertile grounds for them to manipulate the reality of events and tug at some heartstrings in order to try and spread their poisonous message, and rather than simply ignore such types, as we may initially want to do, would far rather grab the bull by the horns and deal with it, for it is in ignorance that claims such as theirs persist.
Sorry, I really want to hear what he says here. I got distracted.
Just love the bombing of Dresden, although they always claim to the exact contrary, and they love it because it provides fertile grounds for them to manipulate the reality of events and tug at some heartstrings in order to try and spread their poisonous message, and rather than simply ignore such types, as we may initially want to do,
instead of ignoring those types, we then accuse good-intentioned people of being like them.
Far rather grab the bull by the horns and deal with it, for it is in ignorance that claims such as theirs persist. And let's begin with the matter of the Allied air crews strafing civilians and indeed zoo animals on the ground. This claim, simply put, doesn't have a single shred of evidence supporting it. It comes from David Irving, a man 3 times convicted for libel and described by Hope Not Hate, a British anti-extremist advocacy group, as a Holocaust denier. He made the claim in his 1963 book, The Destruction of Dresden, within which he claims that, quote, the American fighter planes also strafed the Tiergartenstrasse. Casualties on record here include the choir inspector, seriously wounded, and one of the choir boys killed. Everywhere where columns of people were trudging in or out of the city, they were pounced on by the fighter planes and machine-gunned or raked with cannon fire. The claim is absolute nonsense. The choir boy, to which Irving refers, was killed, but by a British bomb, not strafing. Such misrepresented facts are, rather pathetically, Irving's MO, as he takes real sources, lies about what they say, and then just hopes that no one will ever take the effort to fact-check him. But look, unfortunately for Irving, fact-check his claims we have. If you want to know what a real historian has to say on the matter, Dr. Helmut Schatz spent the better part of a decade investigating the strafing stories from Dresden, and he concluded that no such attacks on civilians had happened. And then there's the death toll, which most contemporary historians, your Anthony Beevors, your Frederick Taylors and the like, all place in the region of 25,000. This figure, while beyond tragic in its own right, isn't enough for the revisionists, with David Irving instead placing the figure between 135 and 250,000 at different stages of his career. And where did he get these figures from, you might be asking? Well, that would be by blindly believing the assertions of none other than Joseph Goebbels, you know, the Nazi Reich Minister of Propaganda, a man who, some might say, had a bit of a vested interest in inflating that number.
He was unbiased,
Revisionists
right?
will also claim that Dresden was a strategically unimportant target, either leading you to believe or even saying outright that the city was raised out of naught but vengeful spite. This claim, however, is debunked from a British intelligence report from the 25th of January 1945, which states that, quote, Soviet success depends on the result of a race between the arrival of German reserves and the loss of the Russian advance, owing to logistics difficulties and the distraction of forces on the flanks. That was the reason that Dresden was bombed first and foremost, to aid the Soviet advance with the general ever-present goal of demoralizing Germany and destroying its industrial base more broadly, also acting as secondary factors. And further to that second point, destroying Germany's industrial base, revisionists will also underplay the city's contribution to the war effort, with David Irving saying that, quote, in recognition of the city's lack of any obvious military significance, the Reich government had turned increasingly to Dresden as a haven for administrative departments and commercial offices, end quote. And while the part about Dresden becoming an ever more important administrative center is indeed true, the claim that precedes it is a complete lie, as in reality, Dresden was home to over 110 industrial enterprises that manufactured war materials, including everything from bullets to aircraft parts. All of that, ultimately, is but a surface-level debunking of the revisionism that surrounds the bombing of Dresden, as indeed whole books have been written to set the record straight. For our purposes, however, we just wanted to say that this counter-narrative exists and debunk a few of the big lies. The legitimate debate all centers around the idea of justification. Or, to put it more bluntly, and indeed macabrely, was what was achieved worth 25,000 lives and the complete destruction of a culturally precious city? One who argues that it was not is Anthony Grayling, an influential British philosopher who discusses the matter in his 2007 book, Among the Dead Cities: Is the Targeting of Civilians in War Ever Justified? For him, regardless of the wider context and situation, the bombing of...
Hold on. Is there a difference between targeting civilians and not caring if civilians die? I mean, there's a difference grammatic or in like logically in the sentence, but at what point does, like, in order for you to be accused of targeting civilians, like if what does that mean? Does that mean like there wasn't enough war manufacturing in an area to justify the amount of civilians you killed in that area? And I know it can be frustrating when, you know, if someone like punches you in the face first, you were doing nothing, and then you go back and you stab them, right? Maybe the stabbing wasn't, you know, that was too far, but you weren't the instigator. And so there's a moral conundrum for me in those circumstances. I'm trying to compare, like, well, Germany started the war in the first place, and you're going to punish the ones who stopped them. Well, if that's your answer, then you can do literally anything if someone to someone who instigates. And, you know, that's a little more difficult to, but I do understand, like, the kind of, wait, so you're trying to punish the British and Americans, planes, and for perhaps committing a war crime against a belligerent power who started the war in the first place. I get that, but also you can't therefore have a free range to commit any act that you want. So there's a balancing act that is difficult to balance on.
Civilian populations
That makes
is
sense?
simply an unacceptable act in warfare, period. Not that he refutes that moral imperative behind destroying a regime as morally repugnant as Nazi Germany, do note, as indeed he is very clear that he believes that to have been a most noble goal. It was just that for him, the bombing of civilians was not how such an end should have been achieved. Expanding his ideas further, Grayling references how Allied officials knew their actions would inflict massive civilian suffering, yet persisted, particularly in the last months of the war when German resistance was already crumbling. He also stresses that even if such tactics did contribute to an earlier victory, they risked transforming the liberators into perpetrators of unjustifiable violence, undermining the moral imperative behind an anti-Nazi war effort. Then there is the historian Richard Overy, who presents a more nuanced and approving take that explores the strategic intentions behind the bombing campaign. While he acknowledges that the raid on Dresden resulted in high civilian casualties, he also highlights the role of the bombing in damaging the German war economy and reducing the Wehrmacht's fighting capacity. Further,
That's the issue I have is at what point is if this is the argument, then at what point is the ratio between destruction of legitimate military targets and being okay with the inevitable civilian deaths when targeting that? That you can't just be vague about that. If you're going to be accused of targeting civilians, what is the threshold of okay civilian deaths in pursuit of military targets and not okay civilian deaths in pursuit of military targets?
He also draws attention to the fact that the Allies faced a serious dilemma in the absence of sufficient resources to mount an immediate large-scale offensive into the German heartlands. Thus, the bombing campaign, despite its blunt nature, was the only means available to weaken Germany's defenses until such an effort could be greenlit. He also stresses that Dresden's role as a transportation hub also rendered it a target of strategic relevance, though he does say that in his opinion, the city's industrial output, which he personally deems to have been relatively limited, did not warrant the total destruction of the city.
That's an argument that I can start to definitely listen to. An even better example for answering my question would be the atomic bombs, because atomic bombs, you know the yield of the bomb, you know more or less the approximate population of a city you're aiming for, and so that's like a direct, is completely destroying the city with a giant bomb. Okay, like is 80,000 civilian deaths okay for X amount of industrial output? And that's a question that it has to be answered if you're going to unbiasedly accuse this targeting of civilians, you know?
Points to the lessons Britain had drawn from earlier attacks on
Let me know if what I'm saying doesn't make sense, all right? Please, obviously, do that.
He also points to the lessons Britain had drawn from earlier attacks on its own cities, such as Coventry, arguing that Britain's leaders were not unaware of the suffering they might inflict, but still felt compelled to act in light of Nazi brutality. As for Anthony Beeville, author of more World War II histories than we've had hot dinners, he draws particular attention to how the bombing of Dresden benefited the Soviet war effort as a justification, just as that intelligence report we saw earlier outlined. He explains this by pointing out that the bombing forced Germany to divert anti-aircraft forces from the Eastern Front, which enormously benefited the Soviet Union's advance into Germany and thereby hastened the end of the war. He also stresses that while many Western perspectives focus on Dresden as an isolated event, it should be seen as part of a larger effort to expedite Germany's surrender and prevent further casualties among Allied forces. While he recognizes the moral discomfort that arises from considering these attacks, Beeville maintains that Dresden's strategic destruction served a broader Allied purpose, thus offering a form of justification in context. Conversely, Patrick Bishop, author of Bomber Boys, highlights the cultural and moral backlash against the Dresden bombing, even among the Allied ranks at the time. More specifically, he notes that many viewed the Dresden raid as excessive, especially since it took place when the Nazi regime was nearing defeat. As evidence for this, he cites Allied servicemen and the British public, many of whom expressed horror at the scale of destruction at the time, and further points out how even Winston Churchill himself later distanced the government from the raid's intent, a backlash that illustrates how even some of those committed to defeating Germany viewed Dresden's devastation as an act misaligned with their moral and military objectives.
I also wonder if the second round of the bombs that ultimately ended up like lighting all of the rubble on fire, if that was even beneficial in any way, because part of me wonders, I'm no military expert, obviously, but part of me wonders if a semi-destroyed city might cause more effort by the power you're attacking, rather than just leaving no doubt that this place is completely destroyed and like there's, everyone in there is dead. There's nothing salvageable. So I wonder if actually just the initial bombing would have been more beneficial to the Allies than complete destruction. It's like the argument that I heard like in the Vietnam War, they would actually try to wound you, the American soldier, rather than kill you, because if you're dead, they're dead. But if they're wounded, you have to like carry them around, and that takes out even more people. And so that crosses my mind. If the second bombing, not just that it wasn't necessary, but might have actually made it easier.
More broadly, whatever historian
for the German forces to make a decision. I hope that made sense.
With their moral and military objectives. More broadly, whatever historians personally believe and argue, many are very keen to stress the difficulties that are presented by viewing controversial historical events through a contemporary lens, with Richard Overy pointing out that in his belief, hindsight is often used to impose moral judgments on decisions made in dire circumstances. He cautions against judging actions by today's norms, arguing that the bombing must be understood within the context of wartime.
Absolutely,
British
sure.
leaders felt compelled to act decisively against Germany. Others, however, argue that this modern lens, rather than being a difficulty that must be considered when rendering one's verdict, is actually the ultimate arbiter of the matter, with Anthony Graylin arguing that morality is an unwavering constant.
If you were there at the time, perhaps that's correct. If you were there at the time and then decades later did that, but that's like judging someone who's in a house, judging someone who, like, being someone who is never in a fire, judging someone who is in a house fire for not saving this or that. It's like you weren't there. You don't know how your body or your mind would react. And so I agree that morality should be more static, but it is so much easier to say something that is morally right when there is no consequence to your words,
And so if we would deem an act to be unacceptable today, we must render the same judgment retroactively, regardless of the nuances of the event that may otherwise sway our verdict. When all is said and done, however, Grayling maintains that Dresden's bombing was less a necessary evil than a preventable tragedy, and should be understood as a stark warning against the excesses that can arise in wartime. So then, which perspective is correct? Was the bombing of Dresden a war crime, or was it just a tragic military necessity?
The fact that it was nearing the end of the war does leave a little more credence to maybe it was unnecessary, but it's difficult to accept that you need to save people that are your enemy at the cost of your own men dying. That was the big thing about the atomic bomb droppings on Japan, which I still don't have a really strong opinion whether it was a good or bad thing, but it's difficult when you're at war with someone that's such a destructive war to say, all right, I have to allow more of my soldiers to die to save more of their civilians. Because that's the thing. And so does that mean that if you have the bombs to do so, you can just kill everyone to avoid one of your soldiers' deaths? That's a difficult moral question I don't know the answer to. So, yeah, that's kind of my thoughts here.
We aren't so much interested in imparting our own perspective onto you as we are helping you to render your own. With that in mind, let's close the video with a quote, just so you can be reminded of exactly what it is that you're grappling with when forming your perspective. Specifically, a quote from one Lothar Metzger, a Dresden native who was but a boy during the bombing. About 9:30 p.m., the alarm was given. We children knew that sound and got up and dressed quickly to hurry downstairs into our cellar, which we used as an air raid shelter. Some minutes later, we heard a horrible noise. The bombers. There were non-stop explosions. The lights went out and wounded people shouted dreadfully. In great fear, we struggled to leave the cellar. We did not recognize our street anymore. Fire, only fire, wherever we looked. Our fourth floor did not exist anymore. The broken remains of our house were burning. On the streets, there were burning vehicles and carts with refugees, people, horses, all of them screaming and shouting in fear of death. I saw hurt women, children, old people searching a way through ruins and flames. We fled into another cellar, overcrowded with injured and distraught men, women and children shouting, crying, praying. No light except some electric torches. And then suddenly, the second raid began. This shelter was hit too, and so we fled through cellar after cellar. Many, so many desperate people came in from the streets. It is not possible to describe. Explosion after explosion, it was beyond belief, worse than the blackest nightmare. So many people were horribly burnt and injured, and it became more and more difficult to breathe. It was dark, and all of us tried to leave this cellar with inconceivable panic. Dead and dying people were trampled upon. Luggage was left or snatched up out of our hands by rescuers. The basket with our twins, covered with wet cloth, was snatched up out of my mother's hands, and we were pushed upstairs by the people behind us. We saw the burning street, the falling ruins, and the terrible firestorm. My mother covered us with wet blankets and coats that she found in a water tub. We saw terrible things. Cremated adults, shrunk to the size of small children, pieces of arms and legs, dead people, whole families burned to death, burning people running to and fro, burnt coaches filled with civilian refugees, dead rescuers and soldiers. Many were calling and looking for their children and families. And fire everywhere. Everywhere fire. And all the time, the hot wind of the firestorm threw people back into the burning houses they were trying to escape from. I cannot forget these terrible details. I can never forget them.
That is, that's horrific. I don't have better words that I can think of to describe that. And that amount of just sheer panic and hopelessness, but I'm sure you're just panicking. Like I feel like people will turn to animals out of no wish of their own in times like that. Like, do you know, like even by wartime standards, that is a insanely horrific experience. If you've ever known about how, like what happens in a fire in a building where there are a lot of people in, often that's why, like, if you ever had fire drills in school and they were always like single file, right? And it's like single file, like you're just wanting to get the hell out of there, you know? But that human animalistic urge to escape imminent danger is like, morality there doesn't exist, I feel like, in that moment. And a lot of the times when there isn't a good evacuation, people will jam the doorway with just their bodies because everyone is just thinking, get out, get out, get out, get out. And then way more people died than they would have if they were a little bit more orderly. But I feel like an orderly evacuation of a fire would only really work in the very early stages when something's on fire and it's not. But as soon as it, like, smoke is everywhere, I can't imagine this sort of panic and just your brain is just get out of the building. And to get out of the building, and even if you do get out and the whole city's on fire, that is beyond hell, horrific, terrifying. And another thing that this makes me think of also is just how if you had nothing to do with starting the war, I don't care if you are French or if you are British or if you're German or if you're a Soviet person or a Japanese civilian, just knowing that the decisions of other people higher up can cause such horrific outcomes for you is insane. Just because someone was born in Germany in World War II or Britain in World War II, that doesn't mean either one of them is more or less moral or innocent or guilty than the other person. For some people, it might be, but that's horrifying how just innocent people can face the most horrific destruction and death of even soldiers, you know. All right, love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. I would love any comments on any of my comments. You agree, disagree, that I say something stupid, please call me out. If you could answer any of my questions, please do that. You guys are great with that. Hopefully, I'll see you guys next time. We'll keep on learning. Bye, guys.